Since the beginning of time, man has always dreamed of being able to fly like the birds. From the Greek myth of Icarus donning wax wings and flying too close to the sun, to ancient Maori tribesmen using giant kites to actually pick up warriors and attack their enemies from above, man has always been obsessed with flight. In the mid-15th century, Leonardo da Vinci would spend hours studying how birds flew. He became intrigued at the thought of man being able to fly and came up with innovative designs in an attempt to achieve this goal. On November 21st, 1783, Francois de Rosier and Francois Laurent took off in a hot air balloon in Paris, France, to become the first humans to actually leave the surface of the Earth. In 1853, English engineer and inventor George Cayley built the first working glider. Throughout the late 1800s, mankind continued his pursuit, using technology in hopes of someday being able to fly amongst the clouds. It wasn't until December 17, 1903, that two brothers at a grassy field in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, were successful in achieving powered flight. Thus, Wilbur and Orville Wright became the first pioneers of modern aviation. The Wright brothers would become the first of many aviation pioneers who have helped mankind achieve the dream of undoing the shackles that have kept us tied to the earth since the beginning of time. On May 21, 1927, Charles Lindbergh landed in Paris, becoming the first person to ever complete a solo transatlantic flight. On August 27, 1939, Eric Worsitz became the first person in the world to successfully pilot a jet aircraft. On October 16, 1947, Chuck Yeager became the first pilot to break the sound barrier. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. And then there was one woman whose courage, determination, and charm captivated a nation. In today's episode, we look into the mysterious disappearance of Amelia Earhart. The year is 1932. Amelia Earhart returns home to the United States to a hero's welcome. Amelia Earhart has just become the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. The nation is in the grips of the Great Depression, but on this day nothing else matters. America has fallen in love with this brave and courageous woman.
It's much easier to fly the Atlantic Ocean now than it was a few years ago. I expect to be able to do it in my lifetime again. Possibly not as a solo expedition, but in regular transatlantic service, which is inevitable in our lifetime.
Amelia Earhart was also the first woman to fly solo across the continental United States. 2 years later, she set the world altitude record of 18,415 feet while flying a Pitcairn autogyro. In 1935, she became the first person ever to fly solo from Hawaii to California. Between 1930 and 1935, Amelia Earhart had set 7 world aviation speed and distance records. In 1936, Earhart had set her sights on a new record. She was planning on circumnavigating the globe. Although others had flown around the world before, hers would be the first to follow a roughly equatorial route and, at 29,000 miles, would also be the longest. Amelia Earhart had a customized Lockheed Electra 10E specially built for her at the Lockheed plant in Burbank, California. The aircraft had additional fuel tanks mounted in the fuselage to increase its range. Shortly before departing on her flight around the world, Earhart sat for an interview along with her husband, George Putnam.
And if the flight's successful, I hope it will increase women's interest in flying. If so, it will be worthwhile as far as I'm concerned.
Well, how about taking me along?
Well, of course, I think a great deal of you, but 180 pounds of gasoline on a flight perhaps might be a little more valuable.
You mean you prefer 180 pounds of gasoline to 180 pounds of husband?
In June of 1937, Amelia Earhart, along with her navigator Fred Noonan, took off from Oakland, California, and traveled east in their attempt to circumnavigate the globe. They successfully made stops in Miami, Florida, South America, India, and arrived safely at Ley Field in New Guinea on June 27, 1937. At this point, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had completed 22,000 miles of their 29,000-mile total. The last 7,000 miles would be their most difficult, having to navigate to small islands dotted across the vast Pacific Ocean. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from New Guinea and headed east toward Howland Island, a small strip of land in the South Pacific. Amelia Earhart never arrived. Earhart and Fred Noonan and the Lockheed Electra had disappeared. News of Amelia Earhart's disappearance shocked the world. Almost immediately, rumors began to abound about what may have happened to her. Some believed that Amelia and Fred Noonan were alive and were stranded on a remote, deserted island. Others believed she was shot down by Japanese fighter planes and were either killed or captured, possibly because they were on a secret spy mission for the U.S. government. Retired Air Force Major Joseph Gervis spent years investigating the Amelia Earhart disappearance. In an interview with the In Search of TV show, broadcast in 1977, Gervis shared what he believes happened to Earhart and Fred Noonan.
The last flight was really a military flight. 2 civilian people flying a civilian aircraft on a mission for the then President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. The purpose of the flight was to overfly the Truk atoll in the Pacific where the Japanese were secretly fortifying, to take pictures of it and to return back to the United States with photographic evidence to present to the League of Nations that Japan was in violation of the treaty. The Japanese, with an aircraft carrier stationed between Canton Island and Hull and with Japanese Zero, intercepted Earhart and shot her down, and she made a crash landing on the island of Hull.
Jervis's conclusions are largely based on transcripts of civilian radio reports received during that time frame. A report from a former Japanese soldier claimed that a female pilot was captured on Hull Island. The pilot was interrogated and taken to Japan as a prisoner. Rumors began to spread among Allied soldiers during the Pacific Campaign in World War II that the infamous Tokyo Rose, a woman who broadcast propaganda targeting Allied soldiers' morale, was actually the voice of Amelia Earhart. Over the decades, reports came in from all over the South Pacific of bones or wreckage being discovered. Although many intriguing clues have emerged, no definitive proof has yet to be obtained. In November of 2006, an episode of the television show Undiscovered History aired on the National Geographic Channel. In it, the show claims that Amelia Earhart did survive and was living under an assumed name and identity. In 1965, Joseph Gervis was a guest speaker at a meeting of retired pilots in New Jersey. While there, Jervis met a woman named Irene Bolam, who he immediately recognized as being Amelia Earhart. Although Bolam vehemently denies being Earhart, the visual similarities are quite striking. Additionally, the sound of her voice is similar to Earhart's as well.
The fantastic story which makes me out to be some kind of a mystery woman who is undoubtedly Amelia Earhart is utter nonsense. I am not a mystery woman. I am not Amelia Earhart.
This, along with the fact that Bolam herself was a former pilot, makes for a very compelling argument. Upon Bolam's death, Jervis asked for permission to obtain her fingerprints, but his request was denied. Was Amelia Earhart really shot down and captured by the Japanese? Did she run out of fuel and crash and die in the Pacific? Is it possible that Amelia Earhart survived and peacefully lived out her life in New Jersey? Whichever is the case, Amelia Earhart will go down as one of the greatest pioneers in aviation history.